Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let us set aside the noise of the modern world and drift back into a quieter time at least, a time that appears quiet from a distance. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your breathing slow as we step into Renaissance Italy, not through the grand triumphs of art and architecture, but through the private lives of the families who lived behind those heavy stone walls. When most people think of the Renaissance, they imagine beauty. Sunlit courtyards, marble statues, paintings glowing softly in candlelight. They picture genius artists, graceful nobles, and a world awakening into culture and learning. But beneath that elegant surface was another reality, one shaped by tension, ambition, and constant uncertainty. To belong to a powerful Renaissance family was not simply a privilege. It was a condition of permanent alertness. In Renaissance Italy, noble families did not merely live together. They navigated one another. Every relationship was layered with expectation, history, and unspoken calculation. Power was inherited, but it was never guaranteed. A family's position could rise or fall within a single generation, sometimes within a single season. And because of this, daily life was shaped by a quiet but persistent awareness. Nothing was ever truly stable. From the moment you were born into such a family, you became part of a long and complicated story. Your name carried weight, alliances made decades earlier, rivalries that had never quite cooled, agreements written in fading ink but still honored in spirit. You were not only yourself. You were a representative of your lineage, whether you wanted to be or not. This meant that even ordinary days carried significance. A casual remark could be remembered. A misplaced smile could be interpreted. Silence itself could be suspicious. In households, where reputation mattered as much as wealth, every action felt observed, measured, and stored away for future reference. These families lived together in vast palazzi, beautiful, echoing structures designed to impress the outside world. Thick stone walls promised security, but inside them, the atmosphere was rarely relaxed. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. Rooms were shared. Corridors carried sound easily. Servants moved constantly, witnessing conversations, expressions, moods. Nothing stayed entirely hidden. Power within the family was rarely equal. Birth order mattered. Age mattered. Marriage prospects mattered. Who sat closest to the head of the table mattered. Even favor could shift subtly, without announcement, leaving someone suddenly uncertain of their standing. To be part of such a household was to develop a heightened awareness of social signals, a skill learned early and refined over time. Trust, while spoken of often, was treated carefully. Loyalty was expected, but it was also tested. Families depended on one another for survival in a competitive political landscape, yet they also knew that internal disagreements could be as dangerous as external threats. Disputes over property, inheritance, or influence were common, and they rarely resolved quickly. What made this environment particularly intense was the closeness of daily life. Unlike modern power structures, which are often distant and institutional, Renaissance power lived at the dinner table. It walked through the same hallways. It slept under the same roof. Your rivals might also be your relatives. Your allies might become competitors without warning. In such conditions, vigilance became a habit. Not a dramatic, constant fear, but a low, steady awareness. A sense that one should listen carefully, speak thoughtfully, and never assume complete safety. Even moments of celebration carried an undertone of caution. Feasts were social performances as much as pleasures. Weddings were political statements. Religious observances doubled as displays of unity or quiet rivalry. This was not necessarily a world of constant open conflict. In fact, much of the tension was subtle. It lived in pauses. In carefully chosen words. In what was not said. Families developed a shared language of implication and restraint. Disagreements were often postponed, softened, or redirected rather than confronted directly, at least until circumstances made confrontation unavoidable. For children growing up in such households, this atmosphere was normal. They learned early how to observe adults, how to recognize shifts in tone, how to understand that affection and expectation were closely linked. Education included not only reading and writing, but also social awareness, knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to disappear into the background. Despite all this, these families were not constantly miserable. There were moments of warmth, humor, and genuine connection. But even those moments existed alongside the knowledge that roles mattered, and that the family's collective future depended on individual behavior. Personal desires often came second to long-term strategy. The pressure to maintain status was constant. A family's reputation was fragile, shaped by public opinion, rumor, and visible success. Art, architecture, and generosity were not just expressions of taste, they were tools of survival. To appear powerful was, in many ways, to be powerful. And failure to maintain that image could invite challenges. Because of this, Renaissance families often lived in a state of quiet readiness. Ready to adapt. Ready to respond. Ready to protect what they had built. This readiness was not always dramatic or anxious on the surface. Often, it was calm, practiced, and deeply ingrained, a way of moving through the world with measured steps and controlled expression. When we look back now, centuries later, it is easy to romanticize these lives. To focus on the art and forget the tension. To admire the legacy without considering the cost. But for those who lived it, the Renaissance was not only a rebirth of culture. It was also a demanding social environment where belonging to a powerful family meant carrying the weight of expectation every single day. And so, as we begin this journey through the darker, quieter side of Renaissance family life, it helps to remember this first truth. These families did not rest easily in their power. They lived within it carefully, constantly, and always aware that stability was something to be maintained, not assumed. Take a slow breath. We have only just opened the doors of the palazzo. And the day and its many unspoken negotiations is only beginning. If living inside a powerful Renaissance family meant carrying constant awareness, then daily life itself became the stage where that awareness quietly unfolded. Not through dramatic confrontations or open hostility, but through routine moments that never felt entirely ordinary. In these households, even the most familiar actions were shaped by caution. Morning did not begin with ease. It began with assessment. Waking up inside a Renaissance palazzo meant entering a space that was both grand and unsettling. The ceilings were high, the walls thick, the rooms cold even in warmer months. There was beauty everywhere: painted ceilings, carved wood, woven tapestries, but comfort was not the goal. These spaces were built to impress and endure, not to soothe. Silence echoed longer than expected. Footsteps carried. Doors creaked in ways that made you listen a little longer than necessary. From the moment your eyes opened, you were already part of the household's rhythm. Servants moved quietly through corridors. Family members rose at different times, each with their own routines, each aware that others were doing the same. Nothing about the morning felt private. Even before a word was spoken, there was a sense of being observed, not always directly, but socially, symbolically, historically. Simple acts required thought. When you dressed, you considered more than warmth or comfort. You thought about visibility. About how you would be seen later in the day. Clothing was a signal. A message. The colors, fabrics, and layers you wore communicated status, confidence, or restraint. Even before breakfast, appearances mattered. And then came the first shared moment of the day. Breakfast, in theory, was a time to eat. In practice, it was a careful social exercise. Family members gathered not only to nourish themselves, but to position themselves. Seating was rarely random. Where you sat, who you sat near, and who you avoided all carried meaning. These arrangements were rarely discussed aloud, yet everyone understood them. Conversation at the table was polite, measured, and rarely direct. Topics often seemed harmless: the weather, recent events in the city, the quality of food, but beneath these surface remarks lived layers of implication. A comment about a delayed shipment might hint at financial pressure. A casual mention of a wedding could signal future alliances. Silence itself could speak volumes. Eating was done attentively. Not hurried, but not careless. In an age without modern medical understanding, illness was common, and causes were often uncertain. When someone fell unwell, speculation followed. Was it seasonal? Was it exhaustion? Or was it something else entirely? Because of this uncertainty, people watched closely. Who ate what? Who hesitated? Who seemed unaffected? The mood was rarely relaxed. Even laughter was controlled. Not because joy was forbidden, but because excess could be misread. A laugh at the wrong moment might suggest confidence, or worse, carelessness. And in a household built on hierarchy and reputation, carelessness was remembered. After breakfast, the day unfolded through movement and obligation. Members of the family went about their responsibilities, managing property, overseeing finances, attending meetings, receiving visitors. These tasks were serious, but they were also social performances. Every interaction reinforced standing within the family and beyond it. Within the palazzo, movement was constant. Servants passed through rooms, carrying trays, cleaning surfaces, adjusting furnishings. Their presence was normal and necessary, yet it contributed to the sense that nothing was ever entirely unseen. Words spoken too freely could travel. Expressions could be noted. The household functioned like a living organism, absorbing information through every corridor. For those living inside it, this created a subtle tension that never fully lifted. It was not panic. It was not terror. It was a quiet attentiveness, maintained day after day. A habit of awareness. A learned caution. Meals later in the day followed similar patterns. Lunch and dinner were longer, more formal, and often more revealing. Guests might be present. Conversations expanded. Performances became more elaborate. But the underlying dynamic remained the same. You spoke carefully. You listened closely. You observed reactions as much as words. Even moments meant for rest were shaped by this atmosphere. Time alone was limited. Rooms were shared or easily accessed. Letters were written with caution. Notes were folded carefully, sealed deliberately, and entrusted only to those considered reliable, a category that could change without notice. As evening approached, the household grew quieter, but not calmer. Candles were lit. Shadows deepened. Sounds became more noticeable. Footsteps in the corridor, a door opening somewhere else in the building, the murmur of distant voices, all of it contributed to an environment where sleep did not come easily. Night was not simply the absence of day. It was a shift in awareness. Doors were closed more deliberately. Valuables were kept nearby. Beds were arranged with intention. People listened before settling. Even in stillness, the mind remained alert. This daily rhythm, wake, observe, participate, withdraw, shaped how people thought and felt over time. Living this way did not always feel dramatic. In fact, it became normal. Children grew up learning it instinctively. Adults rarely questioned it. It was simply how life was lived inside powerful, Renaissance families. The result was a form of quiet endurance. A way of moving through each day without assuming ease. Without assuming safety. Without assuming that tomorrow would unfold the same way as today. This did not mean constant fear, but it did mean constant consideration. And so, when we imagine Renaissance life, it helps to remember this second truth. For those inside powerful families, Daily life was never just daily. It was layered with meaning, watched closely, and shaped by silent caution. Take another slow breath. The day inside the palazzo is still unfolding. And with it, the subtle tensions that never truly rest. In Renaissance Italy, clothing was never just clothing. It was language. It was strategy. And more often than not, it was endurance. When you dressed each morning inside a powerful family, you were not choosing what felt good. You were choosing how you would be perceived. Every layer of fabric carried meaning, and every detail from color to cut communicated something about your position, your confidence, and your place within the family hierarchy. Comfort was not a priority. Visibility was. The garments of Renaissance nobility were elaborate by design. Heavy fabrics, tight lacing, stiff collars, and carefully structured shapes were meant to reshape the body itself. Movement was restricted. Breathing required adjustment. Sitting and standing became deliberate acts. Clothing forced awareness of posture, of presence, of self-control. To wear these clothes was to submit to a kind of discipline. The body had to conform to expectation. Ease was secondary to impression. And impression, in this world, mattered deeply. Colors alone could speak volumes. Deep reds, rich blues, and dark velvets suggested wealth and influence. Lighter fabrics might imply modesty, restraint, or careful positioning. Certain dyes were expensive and regulated, meaning that what you wore could quietly signal your access to resources. To dress incorrectly too boldly or too simply risked commentary. Even within the same family, clothing reflected internal dynamics. Older relatives might dress more conservatively, emphasizing authority and stability. Younger members might be adorned more elaborately, signaling potential and ambition. Those whose standing was uncertain often chose restraint, hoping not to attract unnecessary attention. Getting dressed was not a solitary act. Servants assisted. Valets adjusted laces. Hands moved carefully, practiced from years of repetition. These moments were intimate yet professional. The body became an object of preparation, shaped for the day's social performance. And the performance began immediately. Once dressed, you carried your clothing through every interaction. Walking through corridors required care. Sitting demanded precision. The weight of fabric reminded you constantly of your role. You could not forget yourself, even briefly. Clothing made sure of that. This physical restriction mirrored the social one. In a household governed by hierarchy and expectation, restraint was admired. Control signaled reliability. Someone who moved carefully, spoke deliberately, and dressed impeccably was seen as composed, someone who could be trusted with responsibility. Clothing supported this image by limiting spontaneity. Even decorative elements served purpose. Jewelry was not just adornment, it was declaration. Rings, chains, and brooches indicated lineage, alliances, and achievements. Wearing them was not optional. To leave them behind might suggest weakness, forgetfulness, or disrespect for the family's status. Yet excess carried its own risks. Too much ornamentation could be interpreted as arrogance. In families where envy and rivalry were constant undercurrents, balance was essential. Dressing well meant knowing where the invisible line was and staying just on the correct side of it. Clothing also functioned as armor, though not in the physical sense. It created distance. Layers separated the body from others. Structured garments limited casual touch. High collars framed the face, directing attention upward, away from vulnerability. In this way, fashion helped maintain emotional boundaries as much as social ones. Children learned this early. As they grew, their clothing became more restrictive, signaling their gradual entry into adult expectations. Loose garments gave way to structured ones. Playfulness was replaced with formality. Through clothing, they were trained to inhabit their future roles. The daily act of dressing reinforced identity. You did not simply put on clothes. You put on the family's expectations. You carried history on your shoulders, quite literally. Each garment was a reminder that you were part of something larger, something watched, judged, and remembered. There were moments, of course, when clothing became unbearable. Heat, stiffness, and weight combined into discomfort that could not be ignored. Yet even then, endurance was expected. To complain openly would be seen as weakness. Better to adjust quietly, to persist without remark. This expectation extended beyond the household. In public spaces, appearance mattered even more. Streets, churches, and gatherings were stages. People observed one another closely. A crease out of place or a garment worn too long could invite speculation. Fashion was constantly evolving, and staying current was part of maintaining relevance. Yet change had to be navigated carefully. Too fast, and you risked appearing impulsive. Too slow, and you seemed outdated. Clothing thus became a way of signaling adaptability, a subtle demonstration that you understood the shifting world around you. Even at rest, clothing did not entirely disappear. Night garments were simpler, but still structured. The body was rarely fully free of form. Sleep came under layers, and even dreams unfolded within a sense of enclosure. Over time, this constant shaping of the body shaped the mind as well. Living in restrictive clothing encouraged restraint, patience, and endurance. These qualities were valued in a society where power depended on control of resources, of relationships, and of oneself. So when we look at Renaissance fashion today and admire its beauty, it helps to remember what it demanded. These garments were not designed for ease. They were designed for presence. To wear them was to declare seriousness, discipline, and belonging. And this leads us to the third truth of Renaissance family life. Appearance was not expression. It was obligation. You wore your role as carefully as you wore your clothes. Tight, structured, and never removed in public. Take a slow breath. The fabric settles. The posture holds. And the day, shaped by layers and expectation, moves quietly forward. In a Renaissance Italian household, meals were never just about eating. They were gatherings, yes, but more importantly, they were stages. At first glance, a family meal appeared ordinary. A long table. Shared dishes. Relatives seated together beneath painted ceilings and hanging tapestries. From the outside, it looked like unity. From the inside, it felt like strategy. Every meal brought the family together in the same space, at the same time. This alone made it powerful. Decisions were not always announced, but they were often tested here. Reactions were observed. Silences were measured. Alliances could be felt before they were ever confirmed. Seating was the first signal. Where you sat mattered. It always had. The head of the table symbolized authority. Proximity suggested favor. Distance implied youth, uncertainty, or quiet disapproval. These arrangements were rarely written down, but they were understood instinctively. When someone's place shifted even slightly, it did not go unnoticed. Once seated, posture became performance. You sat upright, attentive, composed. Slouching suggested disrespect. Fidgeting suggested anxiety. Calm stillness suggested confidence. Even before conversation began, the table was already speaking. Food arrived in courses, but conversation arrived carefully. Topics rarely began with what truly mattered. Instead, they circled gently. A comment about the weather. A remark about a visitor to the city. A passing mention of church affairs. These were safe openings, neutral ground from which people could feel the room. But beneath these mild words, intent waited patiently. A question about travel might really be about loyalty. A compliment might carry comparison. A joke might test boundaries. People listened not just to what was said, but to how it was said and to what followed afterward. Who responded quickly? Who hesitated? Who avoided eye contact? In these details, meaning lived. Meals were long, and deliberately so. Time allowed observation. It allowed conversations to unfold naturally, without urgency. As dishes were passed and refilled, patterns emerged. Who spoke often? Who spoke only when prompted? Who remained quiet yet attentive? Silence, in this setting, was not absence, it was presence held in reserve. Eating itself was cautious. Not rushed, not indulgent. People noticed who ate heartily and who restrained themselves. Appetite could suggest confidence, but excess could suggest carelessness. Moderation was admired. And then there was the matter of trust. In an age where illness was common and explanations were uncertain, food carried an unspoken weight. When someone fell ill, questions followed, not accusations, but wondering. Because of this, people paid attention. They watched who reached for which dish. Who hesitated? Who declined politely? This was not constant fear. It was awareness, the same awareness that shaped all aspects of life in powerful families. At the table, this awareness sharpened, because everyone was present. Servants moved quietly around the room, refilling cups, clearing plates, observing without comment. Their presence was accepted, expected, and quietly noted. They heard everything. They saw reactions from angles others could not. Their neutrality was professional, but their memory was long. As the meal progressed, topics often shifted. Politics might enter gently, disguised as curiosity. A new law. A decision by the city council. A development involving another family. Opinions were offered carefully. Agreement or disagreement was signaled subtly. No one wished to appear uninformed, but no one wished to reveal too much. Marriage was another common subject. Not named directly at first, but implied. A mention of age. A comment about suitability. A reference to family connections elsewhere. These remarks floated lightly, but everyone understood their weight. The table allowed such ideas to be introduced without commitment. A suggestion could be made and observed. Did anyone react strongly? Did anyone look uncomfortable? Did anyone smile just a little too quickly? These responses informed future action. Authority figures, parents, elders, heads of households often guided conversation with gentle pressure. A question here. A pause there. They watched not only the words spoken, but the emotional undercurrents beneath them. The table gave them access to the family's unguarded moments. For younger members, meals were lessons. They learned when to speak, when to listen, when to nod, when to remain neutral. Mistakes were rarely corrected openly, but they were remembered. Over time, these lessons shaped behavior more effectively than instruction ever could. Meals ended gradually. There was no sudden release of tension, only a slow dispersal. People rose carefully. Final remarks were exchanged. Politeness was maintained until the last moment. But once the table cleared, interpretations began. What did that comment mean? Why did that person remain silent? Why did the seating change today? These questions lingered long after the dishes were removed. In this way, meals served a dual purpose. They reinforced family unity outwardly, while allowing internal dynamics to shift quietly. They were predictable, recurring moments where power could be exercised without announcement. And because they happened daily, their influence accumulated. Small moments added up. A pattern emerged. Favor shifted. Confidence grew or faded. All without a single formal declaration. This was the brilliance and the exhaustion of Renaissance family life. Power did not always arrive loudly. Often, it arrived politely, passed alongside bread and wine, wrapped in courtesy. So when we imagine these grand dining halls today, filled with light and art, it is worth remembering what truly took place there. Not just meals, but moments of decision. Not just nourishment, but negotiation. And this brings us to the fourth truth of Renaissance family life. At the table, nothing was casual. Every meal was a quiet rehearsal for power. Take another slow breath. The plates are cleared. The room empties. But the meaning of what was said and what was not remains. In the grand households of Renaissance Italy, servants were everywhere. They moved through corridors at dawn. They stood along walls during meals. They carried trays, swept floors, opened doors, and closed them again. Their presence was constant, familiar, and often underestimated. Yet in families where information mattered as much as wealth, servants quietly became the keepers of both. To live inside a Renaissance palazzo was to live among many eyes. Family members watched one another closely, but servants saw everything. They witnessed arguments before breakfast, whispered reconciliations after dinner, and moments of vulnerability that rarely appeared in public. They heard names spoken in frustration. They noticed who avoided whom. They observed patterns long before those patterns were acknowledged. This knowledge accumulated slowly, day by day. Servants did not need to ask questions. They did not need explanations. Their work placed them at the edges of every moment. While others focused on appearances and posture, servants noticed tone, timing, and repetition. They knew who rose early and who paced late into the night. They knew which rooms were avoided, which doors stayed locked, and which letters were written with unusual care. Because of this, they became the household's quiet memory. In many noble families, servants worked for years, sometimes generations. Their familiarity with the family's habits surpassed that of visiting allies or distant relatives. They remembered old disputes. They recognized recurring tensions. They noticed when a conversation echoed one from years earlier, only with different names. Yet their power did not come from authority. It came from discretion. Servants were expected to be invisible, and they learned to perform this invisibility well. They spoke little. They listened much. They developed the ability to appear present without appearing attentive. This skill allowed them to gather information without drawing notice. Families relied on this discretion, even as they feared it. Because while servants were bound by duty, they were also human. They formed opinions. They remembered kindness. They noticed cruelty. And in a world where loyalty could shape outcomes, these impressions mattered. Not all servants were equal. Some held positions of greater trust: personal attendants, household managers, long-serving aides. These individuals often became intermediaries. Messages passed through them. Access to certain spaces depended on their cooperation. A well-timed warning or a delayed delivery could shift the tone of an entire day. Information did not always move upward directly. Sometimes it moved sideways. Servants spoke among themselves. In kitchens, stairwells, and storage rooms, they exchanged observations. They compared notes. They noticed inconsistencies. Over time, a quiet network of awareness formed, not conspiratorial, but practical. When you live close to power, understanding it becomes a form of survival. Families sensed this network, even if they never named it. This created a subtle tension. On the one hand, servants were essential. On the other, they represented unpredictability. A careless word spoken in frustration could travel. A moment of anger could be remembered. A secret revealed unintentionally could resurface at an inconvenient time. Because of this, family members often moderated their behavior in the presence of servants. Voices lowered. Expressions softened. Anger was postponed. Even vulnerability was measured. The household was never empty of witnesses. Yet servants were not merely passive observers. They could influence outcomes quietly. A letter delivered promptly or delayed slightly. A visitor announced immediately or kept waiting. A comment repeated accurately or softened. These small actions rarely attracted attention, but they shaped perception. And perception, in Renaissance society, was power. Some family members understood this well. They treated servants with care, not only out of kindness, but out of awareness. They knew that goodwill could translate into loyalty, and loyalty could translate into silence. Others were less careful, assuming hierarchy alone guaranteed obedience. History suggests that assumption was risky. Servants also occupied a unique social position. They moved between worlds. They heard noble concerns inside the palazzo and common talk in the streets. They carried gossip unintentionally, simply by existing in both spaces. News flowed through them naturally, like air through an open window. This made them invaluable sources of information and potential vulnerabilities. For the family, managing servants meant managing knowledge. Households developed rules, routines, and expectations designed to limit exposure. Access was controlled. Duties were divided. Sensitive tasks were given to trusted individuals. But no system was perfect. Because daily life was long. And vigilance, while practiced, could not be absolute. Over time, servants developed their own form of quiet influence. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They recognized which family members listened and which did not. They adjusted accordingly. In doing so, they shaped the flow of information as much as anyone else. This influence was rarely dramatic. It did not announce itself. It did not demand recognition. But it existed, steady and persistent. Children growing up in these households sensed it instinctively. They learned which servants were safe to confide in, which to avoid, and which seemed to know everything already. Adults learned to navigate these relationships carefully, balancing authority with courtesy. Because in a household built on reputation, everyone played a role. Servants also bore the emotional weight of the family's private life. They cleaned after arguments. They reset rooms after tense gatherings. They absorbed moods without comment. Over time, this created a form of emotional labor that went unacknowledged, yet deeply felt. Despite this, many servants took pride in their position. To serve a powerful family offered stability, identity, and connection to something larger. They were part of the household's rhythm. They knew its secrets. They understood its unspoken rules. And this understanding gave them quiet strength. So while Renaissance families appeared to control their world through wealth, titles, and alliances, another layer of influence existed just beneath the surface. A layer built on memory, observation, and presence. And this leads us to the fifth truth of Renaissance family life. Power did not only belong to those who spoke the loudest. It also belonged to those who listened the longest. Take a slow breath. The corridors grow quiet. Footsteps fade. But the household remembers everything. In a Renaissance Italian household, speaking was rarely the most risky act. Writing was. Words spoken aloud could fade into memory, softened by tone or context. But words written on paper carried weight. They could travel. They could be intercepted. They could be reread, copied, misinterpreted, or presented at the worst possible moment. And because of this, communication itself became an exercise in caution. Letters were not casual. Every message required consideration long before ink ever touched parchment. Who would read it? Who might see it on the way? What could it be mistaken for if taken out of context? These questions shaped not only what was written, but how it was written. Directness was avoided. Clarity was risky. Instead, people learned to speak around their meaning. A sentence about weather might signal approval or warning. A remark about harvest timing could suggest urgency or delay. Names were replaced with symbols. Places were hinted at rather than named. Meaning lived between the lines, not on them. Even the act of writing demanded control. Handwriting mattered. Sloppy script could reveal agitation. Overly polished phrasing could attract suspicion. Many writers practiced maintaining a steady, neutral hand, not too careful, not too rushed, so the letter itself did not betray emotion. The materials mattered as well. Paper was expensive and valuable. Wax seals were chosen carefully, each one signaling identity and authority. A broken seal told a story. An unfamiliar mark raised questions. Every physical detail became part of the message's interpretation. Delivery was its own challenge. Letters rarely traveled directly from sender to recipient. They passed through hands trusted servants, messengers, intermediaries, each step introducing uncertainty. Choosing the wrong courier could undo the entire effort. Choosing the right one required judgment, memory, and often favor. This meant that relationships with messengers mattered deeply. Reliability was earned slowly. Loyalty was tested repeatedly. And even then, certainty was never complete. Because people moved. Circumstances change. Motivations shifted. To protect themselves, families developed codes. These were not always complex ciphers. Often, they were shared references, phrases whose meaning was known only within a small circle. A line about fruit ripening. A comment on candlelight. A mention of a familiar object. To outsiders, the letter appeared harmless. To insiders, it spoke clearly. Such systems evolved over time. When one code was suspected of being compromised, it was abandoned quietly. New phrases took its place. Communication became a living language, constantly adapting. And yet, even with all these precautions, risk remained. A letter could arrive late. Or not at all. Silence could follow, heavy with implication. Was the message lost? Ignored? Intercepted? Or was the delay itself intentional? Waiting became its own form of tension. For this reason, silence was often chosen deliberately. Not responding immediately could be strategic. Not writing at all could be protective. Absence of communication left fewer traces. It allowed flexibility. It avoided commitment. In some cases, it preserved safety. Families learned when to remain quiet. They understood that not every thought needed expression. Not every concern required documentation. Sometimes, restraint was the most effective response. This extended beyond letters. Spoken communication followed similar rules. Conversations were held in specific spaces. Voices were lowered. Doors were closed. Phrases were chosen with care. People learned to listen for what was not said as much as for what was. Children observed this early. They learned that questions were not always welcome. That curiosity required timing. That knowledge was powerful, but possessing it openly could be dangerous. Over time, this environment shaped how people thought. Communication became layered. Meaning was distributed across tone, timing, context, and silence. Nothing stood alone. Even friendly messages were treated carefully. Expressions of affection were measured. Praise was balanced. Excessive warmth could attract attention. Excessive distance could signal conflict. Balance was essential. This careful communication created a culture of interpretation. People became skilled readers of subtext. They noticed hesitation. They recognized coded language. They sensed shifts before they were announced. But it also created fatigue. Living this way required constant awareness. Every letter drafted, every message sent, every silence maintained demanded energy. Mistakes were remembered. Misunderstandings lingered. And yet, there was no alternative. Because in Renaissance family life, communication was not neutral. It was never just information. It was action. And this brings us to the sixth truth of Renaissance family life. Sometimes the safest message was the one never sent. Take a slow breath. The parchment is folded. The wax cools. And the silence, carefully chosen, speaks for itself. In Renaissance Italian families, rivalry between siblings did not fade with age. It matured. What might begin as small competitions in childhood slowly transformed into something far more serious: a quiet, persistent negotiation over position, recognition, and future security. Brothers and sisters were bound by blood, yet shaped by expectation. Each child represented a different possibility for the family's future, and those possibilities did not always align peacefully. From an early age, roles began to form. Birth order mattered deeply. The eldest often carried responsibility and visibility. Younger siblings learned quickly that they would need to distinguish themselves in other ways. Some cultivated loyalty. Others developed charm. Others learned patience, waiting for opportunities that might arrive years later. These distinctions were rarely spoken aloud. They were understood. As siblings grew older, their paths diverged. Education differed. Marriage prospects varied. Responsibilities were assigned selectively. Each difference reinforced awareness: who was favored, who was trusted, who was watched more closely. None of this was necessarily cruel. It was structural. Yet it shaped relationships in lasting ways. Affection existed, but it shared space with comparison. A sibling's success was both a family victory and a personal reminder. Praise given to one echoed in the ears of others. Opportunities granted to one reshaped expectations for the rest. Over time, siblings learned to measure themselves not only against the outside world, but against one another. This comparison was constant, but subtle. Public harmony was expected. Disagreements were managed carefully. Politeness covered competition. But beneath the surface, memory was long. Small slights were remembered. Offhand remarks lingered. What seemed trivial in the moment could gain significance later. Because the future was uncertain. Inheritance was not always simple or equal. Properties could be divided. Responsibilities reassigned. Alliances shifted through marriage. Siblings understood that today's position might change tomorrow. And so, awareness never fully relaxed. Rivalry did not always mean hostility. Often, it meant preparedness. Siblings observed one another closely. They noted habits, strengths, weaknesses. They learned how each other reacted under pressure. This knowledge was not always used aggressively. Sometimes it was simply stored: a quiet understanding of family dynamics. In moments of crisis, siblings could become allies quickly. Shared history mattered. When outside threats appeared, internal competition often paused. Family unity was not constant, but it was real. Rivalry did not cancel loyalty. It complicated it. This duality defined sibling relationships. At gatherings, siblings sat near one another, exchanged courteous remarks, and presented a united front. Yet each conversation carried layers. A compliment could be genuine and comparative. Advice could be helpful and positioning. Nothing was entirely simple. Over time, siblings developed different strategies. Some chose visibility, seeking influence through presence and participation. Others preferred distance, building strength quietly. Some aligned themselves with elders. Others cultivated independence. These choices shaped not only personal outcomes, but family balance. Mistakes were rarely forgotten. A misjudged comment. A failed negotiation. A public embarrassment. Siblings remembered these moments, not always with resentment, but with clarity. They became reference points, reminders of what to avoid, what to improve, what to anticipate. As years passed, Rivalry aged alongside them. What began as competition for attention became competition for legacy. Who would be remembered? Who would be trusted? Who would shape the family's future decisions? These questions hovered quietly, shaping behavior long after childhood had ended. Yet even in rivalry, there was understanding. No one knew the family better than a sibling. No one understood the unspoken rules more deeply. This shared knowledge created a bond that outsiders could never fully access. It allowed siblings to read one another quickly, to anticipate reactions, to navigate complexity with efficiency. This is why sibling rivalry in Renaissance families was not simply emotional. It was strategic. It influenced alliances. It shaped decisions. It guided restraint and ambition alike. And this leads us to the seventh truth of Renaissance family life. Siblings were not just companions or competitors. They were lifelong variables in a carefully balanced equation. Take a slow breath. The rivalry rests for now. But it never disappears. In Renaissance Italian families, honor was not a private feeling. It was something displayed, observed, and remembered. Honor lived in reputation, how the family was spoken about, how its members behaved in public, and how they responded when that reputation felt threatened. Because reputation shaped opportunity, honor became something that required active care. It was not assumed. It was maintained. Disagreements were rarely ignored. But they were rarely handled impulsively. Instead, families developed rituals for addressing conflict. These rituals gave shape to tension, turning it into something predictable, something governed by custom. In doing so, they limited chaos, at least on the surface. When a slight occurred, it was first acknowledged quietly. Words were chosen carefully. Messages were exchanged through intermediaries. Elders were consulted. The goal was not escalation, but control. A measured response preserved dignity. An uncontrolled one invited scrutiny. Public image mattered above all. To appear calm, composed, and justified was essential. Emotional excess could undermine credibility. So even when feelings ran deep, behavior remained structured. Voices were kept even. Gestures were restrained. The performance of control reinforced the family's standing. Honor disputes often unfolded slowly. They began with observation. Who noticed the slight? Who commented on it? Who remained silent? These reactions shaped the response. Families paid attention not only to the original offense, but to the environment around it. Timing mattered. Addressing a conflict too quickly could appear reactive. Waiting too long could suggest weakness. The right moment balanced visibility with restraint. When action finally came, it was framed as necessary, not emotional. This framing was critical. Honor was defended not out of anger, but out of obligation. Families presented their actions as responses to circumstance, not personal feeling. This allowed them to maintain moral high ground and preserve alliances. When confrontation became unavoidable, it followed established forms. These forms were designed to limit unpredictability. They created boundaries. They allowed both sides to participate without appearing reckless. The ritual itself mattered as much as the outcome. Observers were common. Witnesses ensured legitimacy. They validated the process. Their presence transformed private conflict into a recognized event. This recognition mattered more than resolution. Being seen to act correctly preserved honor, regardless of result. Afterward, behavior shifted again. The dispute was acknowledged, but not endlessly revisited. Public discussion quieted. Politeness returned. Life resumed its rhythm. The memory of the event lingered, but it was folded into the family's history, not left raw. This cycle offense, recognition, ritualized response, return to order shaped Renaissance social life. It allowed families to navigate tension without constant disruption. It created a shared understanding of how conflict should appear. Even those who disliked these customs followed them. To reject the system entirely would invite suspicion. Participation signaled belonging. Compliance reinforced identity. Over time, individuals learned to internalize these expectations, responding almost instinctively. Children observed these rituals closely. They learned how adults handled challenges. They watched how elders spoke, when they intervened, and when they remained silent. These lessons were not taught formally, but absorbed through repetition. Honor, in this sense, was inherited. It passed not only through names and stories, but through behavior. Each generation learned how to perform it, how to protect it, and how to restore it when strained. This performance extended beyond the family. Cities remembered. Communities observed. A family's response to conflict influenced how others interacted with them. Consistency built trust. Predictability built influence. And so, honor became a shared language. Not one of passion, but of posture. Not one of impulse, but of timing. Not one of resolution, but of appearance. This leads us to the eighth truth of Renaissance family life. Honor was less about what you felt, and more about how carefully you were seen to act. Take a slow breath. The moment passes. The ritual completes. And the family, intact and observed, moves quietly forward. In Renaissance Italy, wealth was never a quiet possession. It announced itself, invited attention, and demanded protection. For powerful families, money was not simply a resource. It was a responsibility, a tool, and a source of unending vigilance. The more wealth a family held, the more carefully it had to be managed, not just in ledgers but in relationships. Banking, trade, land ownership, and patronage placed families at the center of economic life. Coins moved daily. Agreements were made constantly. Debts were extended, delayed, or renegotiated. Every transaction connected the family to others: merchants, nobles, city officials, each with their own expectations. Wealth created influence, but influence created exposure. To lend money was to form a bond. To receive money was to accept obligation. These bonds were not always balanced. Sometimes they strengthened alliances. Sometimes they quietly strained them. A debt unpaid did not disappear. It lingered, remembered, shaping future interactions. Because of this, families watched their finances closely. Records were kept meticulously. Documents were copied, sealed, and stored. Trusted individuals oversaw accounts. Discussions about money happened often, though rarely in public. Decisions were weighed not only for profit, but for consequence. Every financial choice carried social meaning. Funding a project signaled favor. Withholding support suggested distance. Supporting one person often meant disappointing another. Wealth forced families to choose, and each choice echoed outward. Yet money also attracted resentment. Successful families were admired, but also envied. Their prosperity raised questions. How had they acquired it? How secure was it? Could it be challenged? Rival families paid attention. So did city authorities. So did institutions that depended on donations and loans. This attention never rested. A prosperous household lived with the knowledge that others were watching, waiting for signs of weakness, miscalculation, or overreach. A failed venture could become public conversation. A delayed payment could shift reputation. Confidence was expected, but excess confidence could invite scrutiny. To manage this, families balanced generosity and caution. They donated visibly, but selectively. They supported causes that reinforced legitimacy. They invested in projects that enhanced reputation buildings, art, public works, while ensuring their resources remained flexible. Money moved quietly when possible. Large sums were not always kept in one place. Assets were diversified. Land, goods, and agreements spread risk. This dispersion created stability, but also complexity. Managing wealth required constant attention and coordination. For those within the family, this environment shaped daily thought. Conversations about opportunity were frequent. Risks were discussed calmly, repeatedly. Young members learned early that wealth did not guarantee ease. It demanded discipline. Carelessness could undo generations of effort. And even with careful management, uncertainty remained. Markets shifted. Political climates changed. Alliances evolved. A family that prospered one decade might struggle the next. Wealth provided tools, not certainty. This uncertainty encouraged vigilance. Family members paid attention to public mood. They listened for rumors. They observed changes in behavior from others. Subtle shifts in tone or access could indicate financial pressure elsewhere or an opportunity. In this way, wealth sharpened awareness. It required families to be both confident and cautious. To project stability while preparing for disruption. To appear generous without becoming vulnerable. The paradox was constant. Money offered comfort, but not peace. Security, but not rest. Influence, but not immunity. And so, wealth became something to carry carefully like a fragile object held in full view. It demanded steady hands, measured steps, and constant awareness of balance. This brings us to the ninth truth of Renaissance family life. Wealth was power, but it was also responsibility. And the greater the fortune, the greater the need for caution. Take a slow breath. The accounts are balanced for today. But tomorrow always waits. In Renaissance Italy, gossip was not a side effect of society. It was one of its main engines. Information moved quickly in cities built for conversation. Streets were narrow. Markets were crowded. Churches gathered entire neighborhoods at once. News did not travel in straight lines. It flowed through voices, glances, and repeated fragments of story. And once released, it rarely returned unchanged. For powerful families, this mattered deeply. Reputation was fragile. A single rumor could reshape how a family was perceived, admired, questioned, or quietly avoided. Gossip did not need to be true to be effective. It only needed to be believable. And in a society that relied heavily on trust and public image, believability carried enormous weight. Whispers often began innocently. A remark overheard. A coincidence noticed. A detail taken out of context. These fragments gathered momentum as they passed from person to person, each retelling adding interpretation. By the time a story reached its destination, it often carried a certainty that no longer matched its origin. Families understood this danger well. They listened carefully to the city's tone. They noticed which stories repeated, which names appeared often, and which topics drew interest. Silence from others could be as telling as attention. When a rumor emerged, response mattered, not always immediate, but deliberate. Ignoring gossip entirely could be risky. Responding too strongly could confirm it. So families learned balance. Sometimes they redirected attention by offering a more interesting story, a public gesture, a celebration, a visible act of generosity. Sometimes they allowed a rumor to fade naturally, trusting that new stories would replace it. Other times, they addressed it indirectly, through calm statements or strategic visibility. Gossip also functioned as a tool. Families did not merely defend against it. They sometimes used it. A well-timed suggestion, a carefully phrased comment, or a story shared in the right place could influence opinion without confrontation. Because gossip felt informal, it carried a sense of authenticity. People trusted what they heard from neighbors more than official declarations. This made gossip powerful. It shaped alliances before they were formalized. It tested reactions before decisions were announced. It prepared the ground for acceptance or resistance. Those who understood how gossip worked could move through society more smoothly. Servants, merchants, clergy, and artists all played roles in this network. They carried stories between households, between social classes, between public and private spaces. Their voices formed the connective tissue of the city. For individuals within a family, this meant constant awareness. Behavior in public spaces was carefully managed. Clothing, posture, tone all contributed to how one might be discussed later. A moment of impatience could become a story. A visible disagreement could be remembered long after the words themselves were forgotten. This did not mean people lived in fear of speaking. It meant they spoke with context in mind. Even humor was measured. Jokes were chosen carefully, aware of who might repeat them and how. Sarcasm could be misread. Irony could be lost. What seemed clever in one room could become damaging in another. Over time, families developed an instinct for narrative. They understood that stories would be told about them regardless. The goal was not silence but control. To guide the narrative gently. To ensure that when their name appeared in conversation, it carried the right associations. Gossip also served a social function beyond harm. It entertained. It connected people. It gave structure to daily conversation. In a world without constant written news, gossip filled the space between events. It explained change. It gave meaning to uncertainty. But for powerful families, its edge was always present. A rumor could reopen old tensions. It could invite investigation. It could shift favor. And once a story took hold, correcting it was difficult. Denials often sounded defensive. Clarifications rarely traveled as far as the original tale. So families learned patience. They watched. They waited. They chose moments carefully. And through this, they accepted a quiet truth. Their lives were never entirely their own. This brings us to the 10th truth of Renaissance family life. Gossip was not background noise. It was a force shaping reputation, guiding behavior, and quietly influencing power. Take a slow breath. The whispers fade for now. But the city never truly stops listening. In Renaissance Italy, marriage was rarely about affection. It was about survival. For powerful families, a wedding was not the end of a love story. It was the beginning of a negotiation, one that involved land, influence, loyalty, and future security. Personal feelings mattered far less than long-term advantage. Marriage linked families together like knots in a net. Each union created obligations. Debts could be forgiven. Enemies could become allies. Borders could stabilize. Or, just as easily, tensions could be postponed rather than resolved. A marriage did not erase rivalry. It often redirected it. From an early age, children understood this reality. They were raised knowing that their future partners would be chosen carefully, with discussions taking place long before they were old enough to understand them. Conversations happened quietly, between elders, lawyers, and trusted intermediaries. The individuals involved were often the last to be informed. Dowries were central. They represented wealth, but also commitment. A generous dowry signaled seriousness and respect. A smaller one suggested weakness or hesitation. Negotiating its size and form could take months, sometimes years. Land, money, rights, and privileges were weighed and reweighed until both sides felt secure or at least equally cautious. Publicly, weddings were celebrated. They were grand, symbolic events filled with ritual, color, and ceremony. Processions moved through streets. Bells rang. Feasts were held. To the city, the marriage looked like unity and joy. Privately, expectations were more restrained. New spouses entered unfamiliar households, surrounded by relatives whose loyalty lay elsewhere. Trust was slow. Roles were defined carefully. Every gesture carried meaning. The marriage was not a fresh start. It was an adjustment within an existing structure. Love, when it appeared, was considered fortunate but unnecessary. Compatibility was valued more than passion. Calm cooperation was preferred over emotional intensity. In a world shaped by uncertainty, stability mattered more than romance. For women especially, marriage meant transition. They moved from one family's authority to another's. Their behavior reflected not only on themselves, but on the alliances they represented. Their success was measured quietly, maintaining harmony, producing heirs, and navigating complex social expectations with grace. Men, too, were bound by obligation. Marriage tied them to responsibilities beyond personal ambition. Decisions affected not just individuals, but extended networks. A careless remark or visible conflict could undermine years of planning. Despite this, marriages were not always unhappy. Many couples found understanding over time. Shared responsibility created familiarity. Mutual respect sometimes grew into affection. But these outcomes were seen as benefits, not requirements. The true purpose remained clear. Marriage secured continuity. It organized power. It managed uncertainty. And once arranged, it became another piece in the ongoing balance of family life, neither romantic ideal nor emotional refuge, but a carefully placed foundation stone. This leads us to the 11th truth of Renaissance family life. Marriage was a tool of strategy, shaped by calculation, patience, and long memory. Slow your breathing. Let the echoes of celebration fade. Another alliance has been sealed. In Renaissance Italy, family life never truly rested. It did not pause at nightfall, nor soften during celebrations. It flowed continuously through meals, prayers, letters, alliances, and quiet calculations. To belong to a powerful family was not simply to inherit wealth or status. It was to step into a system that required constant awareness. Every day brought new variables. A rumor in the market. A shift in political favor. A disagreement at the table. A letter delivered too early or too late. None of these moments stood alone. Each connected to others, forming a long chain of consequence that stretched across years, sometimes generations. Families learned to think in layers. What happened today mattered less than how it would be remembered tomorrow. Actions were judged not only by intent, but by interpretation. Survival depended on anticipation, the ability to sense change before it arrived fully formed. This created a unique rhythm of life. Outwardly, routines appeared stable. Meals followed familiar patterns. Ceremonies repeated year after year. Traditions anchored households in continuity. But beneath that surface, nothing was static. Relationships shifted subtly. Loyalties adjusted. Risks were reassessed. Even moments of peace carried caution. A quiet day was welcomed, but never trusted completely. Calm could signal balance or simply the absence of visible conflict. Families remained alert, not from fear alone, but from experience. They had learned that danger rarely announced itself. Survival did not always mean victory. Often, it meant endurance. Remaining relevant. Maintaining dignity. Avoiding irreversible mistakes. A family that survived was not necessarily one that dominated, but one that adapted. This adaptation shaped behavior deeply. People learned restraint early. They developed patience. They understood that restraint was not weakness, but protection. Speaking less often preserved options. Acting slowly allowed observation. Over time, these habits became instinct. Children grew up absorbing unspoken rules. They watched how elders navigated tension. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Survival was not taught through instruction, but through example. And yet, despite the pressure, life continued. There were moments of laughter. Shared meals that felt genuine. Even affection, carefully expressed. These moments mattered because they reminded families why survival was worth the effort. The constant game was not fueled only by ambition. It was also driven by attachment to name, to legacy, to continuity. Families sought to outlast uncertainty, to remain standing when circumstances shifted. This brings us to the final truth. Renaissance family life was not chaos without order, nor stability without risk. It was a long negotiation between control and chance, between intention and outcome. A continuous game not played loudly, but persistently. And those who understood this rhythm, who moved carefully within it, were the ones whose names endured. Now, the voices soften. The candles dim. The palazzo grows quiet, at least for a moment. And you are free to rest, knowing that history, for all its drama, was built from ordinary days lived with extraordinary caution. As our journey through Renaissance Italian family life comes to an end, it becomes clear that history is not only shaped by grand events or famous names. It is shaped by ordinary mornings filled with quiet tension, by meals eaten carefully, by words chosen with intention, and by families learning, generation after generation, how to endure uncertainty. These powerful households lived surrounded by art, wealth, and tradition. But beneath the beauty, they carried constant responsibility. Every decision mattered. Every relationship required balance. Every day demanded awareness. And yet, life continued. People dressed, ate, laughed, argued, planned, and rested. Just as we do now. Only within a world where reputation and survival were always closely linked. Tonight's story reminds us that the past was not calmer or simpler. It was human, complex, careful, and endlessly fascinating. So as you settle into rest, let the noise of intrigue fade into history. Let the whispered plots quiet down. Let the candlelight dim. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me, and for allowing history to drift by at a slower pace. If you enjoyed this story, you are always welcome to return for more calm journeys into the past. For now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let sleep come easily. Good night, and I will see you in the next story. Crescent Moon.